Welcome to this new show about policy and culture. My nickname is Gatito Inmigrante. And the reason why I believe you need this new show is because the system hasn't worked for commoners like us. That the reason is very simple. We have been expecting a messiah. We have been expecting a middle point between the Republicans and Democrats, and that hasn't worked for us. The reason is very simple. The Republican Party is still largely dominated by MAGA, as well as the Democratic Party is largely dominated by woke. And the middle point between woke and MAGA is either very inefficient or irrelevant or doesn't exist. So we keep growing apathetic about the system, and that fits both MAGA and woke to keep growing. The reason for that is that we so far have been trying to get messiah. We have been voting for labels, Democrat or Republican, when we should have started from ideas. Let me give you sorry. Let me give you an example from history. In the 30s, the people who elected Roosevelt demanded Social Security and went to him to ask him why he hasn't gotten Social Security as promised. And Roosevelt's answer was, because you have to push me. You have to push me. Take into account that the people were not asking for some safety network or some relief for the elderly. They were demanding Social Security, a specific policy. And that's how you got Social Security. And don't come to me with the tale that Roosevelt didn't have opposition from Republicans. Yes, Republicans had been literally obliterated, but he had opposition all the time from Southern Democrats. So you want you want policy, you have to push with policy. You cannot trust politicians with giving you the promised land. And sometimes, otherwise, you are going to be condemned to a loop uh, of disappointment, because all your legislation is going to be the middle point between the cruelty of MAGA and the whims of activists or the special interest or ignorance of staffers. So that's, and the problem with that is that many good ideas go under the radar, and so we still have no solutions for many problems. And as the show evolves, I will present you with those ideas that go under the radar. With your help, I will get new ideas probably, because the idea is that how we solve this problem. Well, you have to get the middle. You can no longer expect the middle point between MAGA and woke, or otherwise the Republicans and Democrats. You have to create a range between a rational left and a rational right, and there are good ideas at the left or at the right. I am a Roosevelt liberal, and yet there are ideas at the right with which I could live. So those are ideas that are rational, and that's the way you can push politicians and activists in the right direction. Otherwise, you are not going to able to escape that loop of disappointment. And if you have the ideas, you can push them on policy. Otherwise, you will be condemned to voting as fanboys for labels. And let me give you an example, very simple example of the detachment that even academia has with respect to your problems. You can see that in the chart that inflation has a brusque ups and downs, has been having. That's what you see. Those are the black dots connected by blue lines. But if you, but that's not what the economists say. That's not what the economists and policymakers see. They see the red line. The red line, where that comes from moving averages. Those is a legitimate statistical tool, but you don't see the tool. You don't see the average because the ups and downs are so brusque compared to before the 2020s that you live in constant uncertainty. When you have so volatility that is so high, you get uncertainty. And guess what? The New York Fed has a graph that shows how that inflation uncertainty has been growing for those who are normally the less informed, those whose income is around $50,000. That gives you an idea of the detachment between academia, policymakers, and your problems. And that's why this show is necessary, to bring light on the problems within that rational range. So my goals with this show is for during this year to present the problems, some of the problems. With your help in the commentary boxes, we will be able to expand the number of issues. And I am a Roosevelt liberal because during the Roosevelt administration, Democrats were the party of the working class, and they were pretty effective. Even despite all the frustrations Roosevelt had with Southern Democrats. For instance, his plans to reform government never happened. His plans to reform taxation, well, he got a bit more than half, but not all he wanted. And you will be surprised how we have forgotten many of those lessons. It's precisely in this case of inflation, I will bring you examples. And having said that, let me leave you with the second part of our newscast.
Again, good evening. This is Brian Thomas Simons, and we continue with the main headlines of this hour. Chancellor of Germany Olaf Scholz and President Biden gathered in the Oval Office to declare their deep condemnation of President Macron for suggesting the option of sending troops to Ukraine should be kept on the table. Fearing having upset President of Russia Vladimir Putin, the two leaders offered Mr. Putin, as a token of sincere appeasement, the following: sending to Moscow the F-16 Taurus and Atacams that will no longer be needed to send to Ukraine. Sending SEAL Team 6 to capture President of Ukraine Zelensky and delivering him to Russian representatives in the location of Mr. Putin's best convenience. Allowing Russian agents to supervise the upcoming elections in both Germany and the United States, besides making a donation to the AfD and the Republican Party. expelling France from the NATO collaboration until Marine Le Pen is declared the new president of France, promoting the use of Russian as a second language in German and American schools, backing present and future claims for Mr. Putin in both the Arctic and the African continent. Former President Trump calls for a national day of prayer for the destruction of non-white immigrants. After pitching ideas for concentration camps and massive raids like the ones that took place during the Hoover and Eisenhower administrations, former President Trump declared that immigrants are poisoning our country's blood because people of color as immigrants are guilty of the epidemics of obesity afflicting the country. Deport them, and that Coors will no longer add inches to your waist, he stated. Immigrants of color bring Mexican diseases that make you speak Spanish. Immigrants of color are part of a huge conspiracy of which Pizzagate was just the tip of the iceberg. Immigrants of color produce bad weather and bad breath. Finally, immigrants of color are the real guilty parties behind the January 6th riot and the stolen election of 2020. In an interview given to CNN last February, Vice President Harris offered a positive vision of the country and acknowledged the challenges ahead for the Biden administration. In that interview, asked about what her contingency plan was if President Biden had to step down and she had to be the Democratic candidate for president in the incoming 2024 elections, Vice President Harris, in a rare example of honesty in politicians, shared with us her campaign's manager's plans. One, to ask a genie to grant her that wish if she can find one. If consorting with a genie is not possible, she would pretend to have cancer and make the Make-A-Wish Foundation get her wish of victory granted. If the Make-A-Wish Foundation is not willing to cooperate, she would refer to what her advisors consider has been her best moment in front of cameras. The time when she traveled to Guatemala to tell Central Americans, don't come, don't come. If the rehearsal of her declarations in Guatemala also fail, she plans to start a live stream of her in distress from an undisclosed location, threatening to ingest a bottle of pills in case she is not elected. Those are the headlines, and that's the news for tonight. Good night.
Welcome back. You will have to excuse me for this cough. I would like to start presenting some examples of things that may surprise you about foreign policy. Very few people pay attention to foreign policy because they don't see how foreign policy affects their lives. Well, I will give you a couple of examples here. For instance, the number one issue for our foreign policy should be Ukraine. Why Ukraine? Because if Putin wins in Ukraine, he will weigh heavily in our relations with China. That means that probably you haven't paid attention to what Putin has been doing in Africa, just to secure resources and market. But those resources and market are not for Putin because Ukraine is a raw materials exporter. It's for China, because now that Putin cannot siphon his wealth to the West, he needs to do it to the East, and he needs to be protected in a yuan zone where our sanctions will not touch him. And why is that important for us? Because as you saw in 2022, he could cause a lot of damage by manipulating the food market, grain and fertilizers. You can see that he could expand his influence to isolate America, and that will translate sooner or later in higher prices for you or scarcity, because probably once the resources and markets are not ruled by the market, by supply and demand, but by geopolitical considerations, sooner or later that will touch us. And that's why, or will force us to go to wars that we could prevent. Our foreign policy goal, our top foreign policy goal should be to isolate Putin. And yet the Biden administration has consistently pushed Xi, the president of China, in the direction of Putin. If Putin wins, he will become not a junior partner like Kim Jong-un that will cause us not harm, just some temper tantrum now and then, but as a senior partner that will imprint a privateer standard in our relations with China. And how is this more worrisome? Because China has made terrible mistakes on the economy, especially on the property sector and and with respect to their industrial policy. They have engaged in overcapacity, and they are expanding that overcapacity that their internal market cannot absorb. That means that they are going to try to push those products abroad. And if we don't get to an understanding with Xi, that will mean very probably a huge devaluation of the yuan, trade policies, lost jobs, and a trade war, or lost jobs. So then let me give you another example. What in the media appears the most is not Xi, with respect to whom our goal should be to turn him into Japan in the 1980s and 90s, because a confrontation could lead to war. Obviously, if the Chinese policies are going to if they cannot provide the Chinese people the growing rates they have promised, 5% or more, they will very probably try to engage in a war economy, and then we will be in problems, because we will either respond or be isolated. Could that be avoided? Yes. But then we will have to get a new China narrative that allows us to get to an understanding with Xi and reduce Putin to a junior partner. But what you see on the headlines of the traditional media is not this, it's Israel. And even on that, they fail miserably, because if I mention to you that Ehud Olmert, former Prime Minister of Israel, have released a plan for peace that at one time was backed by Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, who represents the decent part of Likud, and the opposition You would not believe me because you haven't seen it. Now you can see it in the headlines of the Times of Israel. But this plan could have allowed us to contain China, would have allowed us much more important, which should be our goal in the Middle East, is to revive Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. Why is this important? Because when Obama signed the nuclear deal, the president of Iran was Rouhani, a moderate for on Iran's standards. He was followed by a hardliner after he was weakened by Trump. He was followed by a hardliner, Raisi. Raisi died in an accident, and now the Iranians have elected another moderate, Pezeshkian. So that means there is a chance that we could undermine the power of the Ayatollahs by elevating Pezeshkian. And the best way we could do that is by signing a nuclear deal. Pezeshkian himself has made a couple of overtures to the West, and yet our policy has been ignoring Pezeshkian, undermining him by backing Netanyahu in his attacks to Lebanon. And we surprisingly, our Middle East goal has turned from getting the nuclear deal or even getting Biden's naive ceasefire to securing the re-election of Benjamin Netanyahu. As ridiculous as it sounds, we are reliving history from 2014 and 2015. We are reliving we are reliving history because the Algerian Revolution, in the Algerian Revolution, you can make several parallels between the Algerian Revolution and what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank. And if you even in the West Bank, you have the Jewish settlers playing the role of the Pied North, and you know how the Algerian Revolution ended. So we should have a much more intelligent policy on the Middle East, especially when the conditions are ripe. If our policy, if our immediate policy, if our immediate goal were to get Galan to split for the government, we might force no new elections in Israel, and then Biden's ceasefire would be something serious because you would have a more reliable partner. Right now, this is the ceasefire proposed by Biden and Ned Blinken depends on the goodwill of Netanyahu and Sinwar. Sinwar is the leader of Hamas, who are the most interested in torpedoing, in undermining that peace deal, because they thrive when there is chaos. And that's precisely what we have allowed Netanyahu to sow, first in Gaza, then in the West Bank, now in Lebanon. And we will also talk about how even his military tactics may not make no sense in terms of counterinsurgency. But we also want to address the culture. We have been allowed to believe that immigrant policy have only two alternatives. The alternative, all the childish activists have the woke side, no detentions, abolish ICE, and all that nonsense, or Trump's cruelty. Some were we are just condemned to bounce from one to the other. But that doesn't have to be true. We could embrace a much more better standard, and that better standard was set by John F. Kennedy in 1963 in a nation of immigrants. We have great work in Pew Research and the Cato Institute at the right that would allow us to make sensible, lasting immigration reform. And yet, we haven't been able to make real progress in policy and not even in the narrative, because you see many people rationalizing now Trump's cruelty, and the best proof of that is the mayhem at the border created by Biden's policies. And the sad part of that is that because of the chaotic way Biden has managed this issue, immigration, we may be, if Trump is elected, to lose all the benefits that immigrants have brought, even in that chaotic way. Imagine if we have made something more sensible. And then let me finish this introduction as with respect to social and racial issues. We have completely forgotten Martin Luther King. In social issues, he is my standard. We have discreetly slipped into the realm of Stokely Carmichael and the woke and woke activists that have nothing to do with the priorities of Black people or brown people or poor people. But you don't listen much about that. You probably listen about the struggles to get more Marvel characters Black, gay, or brown, like me, brown, or in the video games, or extracting apologies because of blackface. Those are not the priorities of Black or brown people. And yet we have allowed this woke cancer to kidnap and trivialize issues that deserve much better solutions. And you can see a little bit of that in the case of California, the wasteful way in which funds has been spent on the homeless. And the sad part is that what we hear now is about the scandals linked to criminal activists who have siphoned, who have embezzled funds for the homeless, and not the case of the good organizations who have made improvements on that field. Why? And that's another reason why this show is important, because we need to know what is necessary to get rid of mediocre activists, of criminal activists, and bring and put up front people who are willing to implement what has worked. And having said that, I finished my introduction. You can follow me and Tom in Twitter, Tom in Facebook, and please subscribe. Give us like, use the commentary box to make suggestions. We are open to give this show the direction that addresses more your interests. And my goals for 2025 is to create that ranch, but we will not be able to create that ranch if we don't have visibility. We need to get at least 3,000 subscribers so we can access to the people with whom we can build that rational range. And having said that, see you in our next episode. Thank you.